Right on time. Go.
All righty. Hi, everybody. Thank you for tuning in tonight. It's good to see all the names and a few faces. Um, so I want to make a save the date announcement this evening. We will be having a fundraiser and membership drive August 17th. And this, we just want to let you know the date for now. We've got more information coming. And so you'll be receiving emails, and we'll be posting on Facebook and Instagram. So if you don't think that we have your email, or if you want to make sure we have your email, send us an email at acssandiego10@gmail.com. So that's acssandiego10@gmail.com. And you can also put or our email is in the chat. So you can either, put your email in the chat or send it to our email. And our website is acssandiego.org. And our Facebook is the American Cetacean Society of San Diego. And Instagram is acs.san Diego. Our August speaker is Dr. Jerry Koyman, and he's going to be telling us about his new book, Journeys with Emperors, Tracking the World's Most Extreme Penguin. And this lecture will take place on the Legacy, and the dock will open at 6:30, and we'll have a meet and greet, and then the lecture will begin at 7 p.m. And we will also have this lecture available via Zoom. For tonight's presentation, please make sure that you're muted and that you type any of your questions in chat, and then the questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Tonight's speaker is Charolette McCurdy, and her presentation is Algae in Sustainable Fashion. And basically, she's found a sustainable alternative to plastics. And we all know that plastics is one of the biggest contributors to pollution and climate change. I read an article that was written by Claire Cameron, and it's in Inverse magazine, and it's dated April 27th, 2020. And the title of the article is Charolette McCurdy Wants You to Forget Everything You Know About Climate Change. And that you believe climate change action takes place, or that it's all 8 billion people and not just the people who shop at Whole Foods that need to be interested in this. I thought that was a great quote. But the author says that Charolette McCurdy is not interested in telling you just how bad life on Earth is as a result, or could be as a result of global warming. She's not interested in telling you to give up plastic or forgo meat to save the environment. She is not interested in telling you to write to your congressman about the plight of polar bears. Instead, McCurdy is interested in the life you live now and helping you keep it that way. And I thought that was kind of refreshing, because so many of our conservation lectures or presentations or talks are all about what not to do and to stop doing, and that you found an alternative, and that we can kind of run with it because it's not doing damage. So with that, I want to thank you for joining us, and take it away.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation. You've set up the provocative angle, so we're all leaning in to this conversation. I'm gonna jump straight to sharing my screen because I'd like to start by getting everyone warmed up on the chat. If you could drop into the chat your name and where you're dialing in from, and 3 words or phrases that triangulate your passions as they relate to climate, oceans, and the future. Let's take a second. We've got our first Rick styling from San Diego. We've got awe, inspiring concerns. Great example. far enough apart concepts. Feels like these words can apply to multiple of these pillars too. Climate change and oceans can invoke awe in different ways. Jane, healthy oceans, healthy marine life, healthy earth. Absolutely. Beauty, Matt, we got another awe. We have the experiences of scale. We've got some sublime romanticism coming in. Okay, feel free to keep that coming in. So just to restate who I am and why I'm here, I'm Charolette McCurdy. I'll play along 3 words that triangulate for me is technology, materials, and design futures tend to characterize what I think about. I'm at Stanford University in the design school, the D school there, and I come from sustainability strategy into design, and a lot of what I've thought about sort of sits in the space of public engagement and education and innovation, and trying to think about the future as it might be and how can we build it together. So what I'd like to do with my 45 minutes that I have with you all, start with a concretion, start with my work in this sort of seaweed fashion space, and use that to abstract out to a couple of concepts that I think connect to the work that you all do at the American Cetacean Society. It's been really interesting to think about the way these topics overlap and touch and sort of like circle back on each other. So one major theme of what I want to talk to you is the intersection of opportunity and constraint. So I come from design, which is ultimately quite pragmatic and often sits in this space between like what is possible within the constraints we have, and that can be technological, it can be financial, it can be social and cultural. What is possible is a fundamental constraining framework, but then within that and around that, how do we find opportunity in the contexts that we are either inheriting or maybe creating, and how do we move through that? So what I'm known for and what is sort of the foundation of what I'm going to talk about is this marine macroalgae based plastic I developed. I know we're all mostly on the West Coast here, but this dress on the left, the green dress, is currently on view at the Met in the Costume Institute show. There, collaborated with Philip Lim on that to take the plastic I developed and make sequins out of it. Sequins, for context, are very hard to decarbonize. The vast majority of sequins available are petrochemical in origin. And sort of the premise of this work is to try to turn to the fashion industry, which is one of the most polluting, one of the largest employers on Earth. It's an incredibly interconnected industry that touches every country, every person. We're all wearing clothes, and it's currently quite damaging. To try to talk to that community in fashion and push for an ambition for sustainability that was more ambitious than just organic cotton and recycled polyester, to sort of ask the question of what would regenerative materials, what would fashion that was actually beneficial and not just marginally less harmful, what could that start to look like? And that sort of gets to the introduction Leon offered around how do we get people excited about building a future that's beneficial in terms of climate change by not framing it just as a desaturated version of the present, but as something that is beautiful and celebratory and full of a sense of gift and aspiration, but because it's been fundamentally reconceived, it can be beneficial to climate and ecosystems and all of the creatures that live in it, including us and including non-human animals. That project started with this. This was my graduate work, the first prototype of a raincoat that's made out of this marine macroalgae derived polymer. It's a naturally occurring biopolymer that I used to make a raincoat that is a proof of concept for what a carbon negative material culture could start to look like. But how does how did this happen? How does that start to happen? So my discipline is industrial design at the D School at Stanford. They're well known for design thinking. There's a core premise of the last several decades of design that human-centered design is the way to make good things. And I'm super excited to be talking to this community of people who are advocates for non-human agents and actors in our world. Should we be surprised that after decades of human-centered design meeting the appetites and desires of individual humans, that we've created a system that harms not just non-human actors, but communities at broader scale? We've created climate change through industrial design, not just through marketing and appealing to people's desires, but through the literal things that we as designers create and make that then proliferate at scale, and the negative consequences of which accumulate rapidly. Not to take sole responsibility, but industrial design as a field feels, I think, a right amount of complicity in the mounting ecological crises that we have developed. So I started from here and from challenging that question of human-centered design and asking the question of what would a system level approach, but also a carbon level approach. So fundamentally, I'm interested in climate change, climate mitigation, and atmospheric carbon concentrations. So zooming out, trying to see the system from the carbon eye view, I got interested in, so this is total global greenhouse gas emissions every year, broken up in several different ways. This is part of the challenge. You've probably heard people talk about how transportation is the X largest slice of climate change, or it's all about oil. It's the way these numbers, when they're taken in isolation, they lose the context of what the list is that they are a percentage of. So I use this to sort of highlight these different slices, and looking at this leftmost column of the original source point for the carbon that then becomes the emission. You'll see this top 2/3. This is what we spend a lot of time thinking and talking about, the burning of fuel for energy generation and transportation. And it is a substantial cut of our fossil fuel emission, or our greenhouse gas emissions based on fossil fuels. But from a technological perspective and from a design perspective, it's pretty much solved, right? So energy generation, solar and wind are cost competitive. Transportation is rapidly evolving, as we all see around us all the time. So I got really interested in this bottom third, this direct emissions slice. And in particular, this band that jumps into industry. And this is broadly going to be the category that's called industrial process emissions. And so this is carbon dioxide or its equivalents that are released not by burning of fuels, but by the intrinsic chemistry of stuff. So cement, plastic, steel are the big players. And this felt like a story that I wasn't hearing. I was curious about. It felt like I was surprised in that moment to, for instance, realize that the Tylenol you might take is petrochemical in origin. 98% of our pharmaceuticals are fossil fuel in origin. Cement is obviously a huge contributor to greenhouse gas. Why is that? What could we pull out of that? Continuing in this thread, I wanted to look at carbon across a super different time scale, right? So as humans, we're so trapped in our perception, our ability to perceive at this very limited focal length. And I want to draw your attention to this period, the Carboniferous period. This is the moment where plants develop lignin. So we go from, we're pre-Pangea here, very, very long time ago. We go from a landscape of ferns to suddenly plants go up. Lignin is this incredible structural polymer that nothing could break down. So for about 100 million years, we have trees growing, falling over, and not rotting because no bacteria and fungi could break it down yet. And this moment of evolution is where our coal comes from. So we think of coal as this very synthetic material, the things we make of it, we talk about as being man-made. but carbon is so integral to life. We talk about carbon-based life. We are made of carbon. Our DNA is full of, like, we are carbon. But we've started to abstract these synthetic man-made materials as somehow being separate from biology. And that seemed like a story we were telling where there was some kind of flip, there's some kind of inversion that I could grab onto as a designer to maybe find a new way in. Okay, this is probably my most depressing infographic that I'm going to give you. So if we are asked the question, then where is the carbon? Like, short of asteroids hitting Earth, right? Conservation of mass, there is a fixed number of carbon atoms on Earth, right? And we are justifiably freaking out about the marginal changes in the amount of carbon in the form of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, right? So 1 atmosphere's worth of carbon dioxide, about 720 gigatons of carbon, is sitting in the atmosphere. There's 3 times as much carbon in terrestrial biomass, right? So soils, plants, on land. So this is part of why deforestation is not just bad from a biodiversity perspective, but when you burn down rainforest to generally increase animal husbandry, that's one of the major drivers of deforestation, the carbon that is embodied in that forest is going somewhere, and it's going up into the atmosphere where we do not want it to go. This community knows all about the ocean and the acidification of the ocean. The ocean is a major reservoir of carbon, and as we pump more carbon into the atmosphere, about half of that carbon is getting reabsorbed into the ocean. We are being buffered against the climatic effects of climate change by the ocean's appetite for carbon, forming carbonic acid, causing acidification, and all kinds of other problems. That's the short-term carbon cycle. That's what biology is used to cycling and dealing with, right? We as humans tap into fossil fuels underground. So this, I hope, like, immediately, ground floor, we're not talking about running out of fossil fuels. We cannot afford to take this carbon out of the ground and bring it into the short-term carbon cycle by burning it. This is just known reservoirs of fossil fuels. There's a whole category called kerogens, which is the precursors to fossil fuels. They've not quite gone through the right combination of pressure and heat and time. They still have some excess nitrogen on stuff like that. We can absolutely figure out a way to burn this. We're a very resilient species, good at species at figuring out how to get energy out of stored chemical potential energy. But it doesn't stop there, because the largest reservoir of carbon is sedimentary carbonates, which my ocean friends here mostly is derived from hundreds of millions of years of marine invertebrate shells, spines, collecting on the seafloor. Whenever we make cement, we're tapping into this pool of carbon. And unfortunately, half of the built environment we will have by 2050 hasn't been built yet, right? Oh, and this is actually not the full sedimentary carbonate bucket. It keeps going. So this is not about fossil fuels running out. This is about where the carbon is, where we want it to stay, and the fact that life and organisms and ecosystems have been spending hundreds of millions of years putting carbon underground, and we are rapidly pulling it out when we make material. So the thing about fossil fuels so often is that they feel very intangible. Maybe you smell a waft of gasoline as you fill your car, but they are physical molecules coming from a physical place. We are dislocating them, and that carbon is then entering the air when we burn them, or if we make them into plastics, you're complicit in the full supply chain. As I talked about, some of the major materials that are contributing to greenhouse gas emissions are cement, steel, and plastic. Cement, because its core ingredient is made originally from limestone, fossilized life. When we take calcium carbonate and heat it up to make the reactive core molecule that we can add water to, we're cracking off a CO2 for every CO3. Steel, because the way we make steel is by adding a little bit of carbon to iron. Right now, that carbon is coming from coal. And this image on the right, tragically, is an aerial view of farmland. One of the easy ways to switch to organic farming, to not need to use pesticides, is to use massive amounts of sheet plastic to protect from pests. So there's massive plastic being used on massive scales in ways that you might not consider. Super briefly, just to talk about, start to drill into plastics. Plastics are intrinsically co-products with fossil fuels. So the way we get plastics, we have crude oil come in one end, heterogeneous mix of carbon molecules of different lengths, ancient algae, right? It's not dinosaur bones. And then we separate these molecules by length. The shorter molecule lengths are the very useful fuels. They're gases, they're liquids at ambient concentration, at ambient temperatures. These longer molecules, these longer, heavy, thicker asphalts, waxes, those are not super valuable. We crack off two carbon molecule length ethylenes, foundation of our petrochemical industry. The materiality of plastic is directly connected to fossil fuels. There is no way to disconnect from that. And now we might be starting to think, but what about recycling? Can't we recycle vast majority of the plastics we produced have not been recycled, and if they've been recycled once, at best, the majority of that second life will go to landfill. But let's start to drill into fashion. In case I don't expect you guys to know this industry, I certainly didn't when I began this project. It's worth really landing on the fact that more than half of our textiles are fossil fuel in origin. So the synthetic fiber bucket, the 65%, it's nice to think that we have these ancient biomaterials, we have these cottons and wools. They do not represent the lion's share of this industry. And if you see this graph on the right, despite monumental efforts from the industry to increase recycling in textiles, it's less than 8% of what the material that's being produced each year is recycled, and of that, it's coming from another industry. There's no circularity. We're not recycling textiles into other textiles. And just as a pause on language, because I'm throwing a lot at you, the distinction needs to be made between a bio-based material and a biodegradable material, right? One speaks of where this material is coming from. Where are we getting these amazing carbon atoms that are forming the lattice of these gorgeous long molecules that we can make fibers out of, make everything we need out of them, versus biodegradable, what happens at the end of the life cycle. So right now we're mostly in this bottom left quadrant where almost everything, so much of our environment is petrochemical in origin and non-biodegradable. And we probably want to be getting more into this top right quadrant where things are both bio-based. And if we're not pulling carbon out of the ground, participating in this short-term carbon cycle that life lives on, and is also biodegradable. But there's plenty of research happening in this bottom right quadrant where we're finding ways to take petrochemical plastics and make them break down mechanically in the environment. That's not great because often you have sort of intermediate microplasticy, you have these mastics that then are, it's not necessarily composting and fully becoming bioavailable. But I don't mean to throw that out because maybe we need those technologies to help build these stepping stones to this top right quadrant. From a climate perspective, I'm most interested in how do we create as more bio-based materials as possible? And I'm not focusing as much on biodegradability. There's so much work happening in that space. I don't feel like I need to be an advocate there. All right, so back to this human-centered. We can take this big top-down systems view and have a precise, maybe even descriptively correct view of the system as it is, but how do we actually start to change behavior? How do we engage with humans as they are, with our cognition as it is? So I have a little thought experiment for you, and you can use this to torture your friends. You'll know the answer now. But if you turn to someone just in passing and you ask them, when a squirrel plants an acorn, buries its little nut so busily, and a huge oak tree grows out of that acorn, where does the mass of that tree come from? The intuitive, instinctual thing to our little primate minds is probably that the mass of the tree comes from the ground, that the tree must pull nutrients from the ground to build itself. But the vast majority of the mass of that tree came from the air, right? Because photosynthesis is this process of taking carbon dioxide and water and using the power of the sun to drive the creation of larger complex sugars, these bigger molecules that then become the foundation of the tree building itself. This is why when you burn wood, you really burn it thoroughly, you're left with just these little trace ash metals. That's the material that's coming from underground, because burning, right, is the opposite reaction of photosynthesis. These two things are interrelated. So this is super not intuitive to us, this relationship between energy, matter, and gas, the relationship between these machines, biological and otherwise, that create these conversions. So right now, so we're starting to build this language around where these things come from. And if you look around you right now, like there's obvious things that are plastic, right? But there's so many things that you might not realize are petrochemical in origin. The dye in all of your garments, even if you're wearing 100% cotton t-shirt, that dye is probably an azo synthetic dye, the finishing agents, the glues holding together even things like wood. It's permeated so much of our life. And so these petrochemical materials, what I'm offering with this diagram is trying to articulate how they are in many ways made of ancient sunlight. They represent the stored chemical potential energy of sun that hit the earth millions of years ago. So how do we end up with something like a garment? The sun hit probably algae if it's petroleum in origin. That algae photosynthesized, pulled down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to build its beautiful little body. That then settled probably to the ocean floor, went through just the right process of subduction and encapsulation and pressure and heat to come to where we are today. And it's petroleum, which we then pull out of the ground, we transport, we divide by length, as we saw in that previous diagram, we chemically transform it, and then we make useful molecules out of it. There's leaking and off-gassing on every step of this chain. In Europe, incineration is much more common for waste materials. So you end up at every point along this chain, releasing that ancient carbon back into the environment. Once I started to sort of frame these materials as being made of ancient sunlight, it begged the question of what would it mean to start to make materials out of present tense sunlight? So why not have sunlight hit algae today, drive photosynthesis that's pulling carbon out of the atmosphere today, and use that as a feedstock to meet our needs for materials, for shelter, for clothing. And it's worth taking a moment here to form a distinction between sustaining and regenerating, sustainability and regenerativity. We are at a point where we don't just need tools to sustain the status quo of where we are. We need technologies to undo the harm we've already done, right? The vast majority, 96%, I believe, of the IPCC scenarios for staying under 1.5 degrees centigrade globally rely on carbon removal technologies that we do not have yet and do not have at scale. We need to be undoing harm, not just finding ways to maintain. So that's part of why I started to focus in on algae as a feedstock, not just because of the elegance of where most of our petroleum comes from, but because algae is such an efficient sequester of carbon. And I probably don't need to tell this community. There also is big problem happening around major macroalgae seaweed blooms that are probably driven by fertilizer runoffs and changing ocean circulation. And so what would it look like to try to meet our needs with photosynthesis happening today? Part of why I also got interested in marine macroalgae is because maybe you guys remember like a food versus fuel debate that happened in the aughts. If we try to use freshwater microalgae, where does that potable fresh water come from? But also, where is it being grown? If we're just using corn to make ethanol, we're displacing one current photosynthetic system with another. We're not actually net increasing our sequestration of carbon through photosynthesis. And so this is where I'm really interested to get into the Q&A with you guys, because I don't want to be showing up here with this sort of technologist, the ocean, new frontier, right, for exploitation, because that absolutely is not gonna be how we actually do better, right? But it does seem like there is an opportunity with 70% of the surface of the ocean being, of the earth being ocean, to have a beneficial system where we can be maybe undoing some human harms, maybe increasing support ecosystems that could be reservoirs, and also be sequestering carbon and displacing fossil fuels in some of our supply chains. And so this gets back to this opportunity, constraint. How do we make hard choices in this imperfect world that we're in? And I want to propose that we are both responsible and response-able, that we have agency in this, but we have really hard constraints shaping what we're able to do. So just some, and maybe this gets back to Leanne, you're talking about some other sort of advice around not doing, don't cause harm. I think one of the reasons why that kind of story is so hard to tell and tell persuasively is that we're so not on track to just do less of what we're doing. So just a quick context, as we've established, at most 9% of our plastics are being recycled. Demand for plastic is projected to triple by 2050. The most major players who do this math expect the majority or the vast majority of demand growth for fossil fuels to be in the petchem plastics materials sector. We are using fossil fuels less and less for fuel. We are shifting that. We're still going to have growth, and it's going to be towards materials and chemicals. So 3 times projected growth in plastics by 2050. Just doing less. 2020, pandemic, we shut down so much of the global economy. We stopped flying, right? And that caused a 6.4% reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions, 2019 to 2020. Like, the economic pain of just stopping is, I believe, politically untenable. There's no government on earth that will be able to stay in power if they just say, we are going to pull the plug. And to what has already been mentioned, we currently are at 8 billion people. We're projected to have 9.7 billion by 2050. How do we hold ourselves accountable to all of those people and a dignified standard of living for all those people? So I'm interested in design as a process, not just as a way of proposing solutions, but for asking questions and for imagining what does not exist yet and creating a space for conversation around that kind of future. Like, I don't mean to, I'm not showing up here saying this solution is algae raincoats and we will all have algae raincoats forever. It's more an artifact of a future that we could start to build towards if we want it, if we're comfortable with the trade-offs. And a core thesis here, as I've sort of mentioned, sort of side checked too, in a lot of these climate technology spaces, it is not a challenge of technological capability or even increasingly financial practicality. There is investment there. We are lacking significantly in political will and collective imagination to drive towards change in a clear-eyed, coordinated way. Another sort of piece of where I'm coming from, thinking as someone in the design future space, there's a concept of the futures cone, which asserts that we are in a non-determinist frame. We are able to be creating the future based on what we are able to vision today. You've probably encountered the Overton window from political theory, political science. The band of norms is something that is malleable and designable and changeable. And then in terms of technology adoption, there's typically thought to be this chasm between early adopters and early majority. So back to how do we not just get the Whole Foods shoppers? How do we make sustainability and regenerative technology absolutely mainstream? How do we have it not just be a luxury that is at a premium price point, but it's just the norm? These are all things I'm really interested in through design. So I started circling on this question in the space of how do I invite people to imagine futures that are not just apocalyptic, but are perhaps aspirational without being unrealistically utopian. Started to center on this question of what would it feel like to get back into a present tense relationship with the sun? So from this premise that before the Industrial Revolution, we met our needs with the energy of the sun directly or indirectly, right? The natural fibers are secondary or tertiary products of solar energy. And how do we do that with 8 billion people? We have to do more with the sun we already have. Maybe this starts to feel like, well, that's not possible. The math doesn't math. Before the Industrial Revolution, like our best technologies for converting sunlight into useful molecules were like C4 grasses, like corn, 2% efficiency in that conversion. Conventional solar panels, you can go out and buy tomorrow, 15% efficiency in that conversion of solar energy. Experimental solar cells are at 46% and up. We can do more with the sunlight we already have. We can meet the needs of a human society. Like if we had the will, I firmly believe this, the maths. I should have this off the top of my head. But the Earth, I don't want to get it wrong, but the Earth, every year the Earth is struck by 10,000 times as much joules in energy as we burn in fossil fuels every year. Like the energy is there. The energy becomes not just energy, but material. So I think that's part of the story I'm trying to help tell. So with that, focusing on algae, I went into hundreds of parallel experiments, smashing together ancient technologies and new ones, learning from traditional leather tanning techniques and how aerogels are dried, and sort of crossing all of these different these different approaches, and mostly ended up with hundreds of beautiful failures, but each one of them taught me something about how I could use naturally occurring wild type polymers that are coming from macroalgae to start to make something that I hope lets us start to think about what it would feel like to live in a society that was back in a present tense relationship with the sun, and to imagine it as something that is, I think some people seem to think, beautiful and exciting and inviting. And why, I get the question all the time, why fashion? Why not packaging? Part of sort of the strategy, the sort of business case for starting from fashion is that it is a space where, as we've discussed, highly impactful, touches huge parts of humanity, has major environmental impacts, but also it is a space where, because it's so connected to our identity, often we're willing to invest more in its low volume, high margin compared to like packaging. And then you might be like, but Charlotte, you just said you want it to not be a luxury, you want it to be accessible to everyone. In this, I'm looking at things like the smartphone, or like Tesla's impact on the proliferation of electric vehicles, that by starting in a luxury space, perhaps the hypothesis is we can get the kind of runway and support that will allow the research, will allow the economies of scales to have these things become cost competitive, right? Solar panels spent decades being way more expensive, but something that people would use to assert the kind of person they wanted to be in the world and what they believed in about the future. If we just go straight at commodity materials, then we're competing on price. This happened with algae-based biofuels, caused a major problem in that research space. A lot of people got burned. So that's part of why fashion, in addition to the sort of storytelling, proof of concept, visioning work that a garment does, that like a piece of bubble wrap doesn't quite. So again, just circling back to this theme of the tension between opportunity and constraint, how do we act from this present that is so imperfect and try to find, in my view, the least bad outcome? And how do we decide who gets to make those trade-offs and who do we empower to be thinking, to be at these tables, to be making these decisions? So the themes, I think, maybe could be interesting fodder for our subsequent conversation, that I think connect the work I do with the work all of you do at the American Cetacean Society, is questions of how do we engage in more than human-centered design while we're also the designers, while we are ultimately the ones who control so much power. How do we do that authentically? I hope I've persuaded you that there's something important about regeneration over sustaining. And I imagine that that resonates with what you're seeing in marine ecosystems. We need to undo harm, not just maintain the status quo we're at. That I think there's an important turn happening in a post-dualist frame. So instead of feeling like humans are culture and nature is over there, synthetic and natural are these really clean and dry categories, that actually there's much more messy interconnection between these things that we used to hold as categories, and maybe those categories have been hurting us and hurting others as well. And that we are response able, that we have and can make more tools for shaping futures and engaging publics, and education, I think, is a big part of that. And I think something that we both share as approaches. And then I authentically am at a dilemma around this, and this is what drives me to do this work, is this tension between opportunity and constraint, and who gets to decide who feels empowered to be at that table, and how do we create tools for that conversation, and have it authentically a conversation and not just prescription. So that's me, and that's what I think about, and I think more or less what I've been asked to talk to you about today. And then I just want to land with, in terms of future things and maybe ways that I could collaborate with all of you in this organization and things going forward. At Stanford, this bottom left quadrant, next year I'll be launching a new approach to the capstone of our design students. And the students, we have a domain focus area model, and one of the domain focus areas is design for planetary health. And so this is going to be a space where I'm going to be bringing in lots of coaches and advisors to help frame challenges for our students to engage with. And I am excited to be on the West Coast, and this group has such a wealth of knowledge of this work at climate and environment, ecology, blue economy, climate tech, and I welcome any and all introductions, or if anything sparked your interest, I would love to talk more. So,
well, thank you, Char, and we encourage people to put their questions in the chat. We have a few. I'll start, but people are invited to add to that list. So I'll start off with one of my questions, and that was I said that it's an impressive understanding of chemistry. Can you talk about your educational background? How did your interest in design or fashion emerge from this kind of solid science background, because it's pretty, and it's a pretty interesting blend.
Thank you. Well, that means a lot coming from you. Thank you. I'm always conscious of the scientists in the room as someone who does not call myself a scientist, certainly. My background is quite interdisciplinary. I was lucky to work in a genetics lab before, like early in my teen years for a couple years. So I got a lot of
fruit flies. Go fruit flies. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go Drosophila.
Absolutely, yeah, and got enough exposure to bench science to know I didn't want to do that. Let's say, incredible, exciting work there, but I think that's part of why I am not super intimidated by sort of experimental approaches to design work. I'm a weird designer. Like, this is not how most designers think and operate. My undergrad degree is in global affairs with a focus on econometrics. So social science experiment design was a big piece of that. And that's where I was starting to work on food system sustainability. So really focused on economic development and that interface between human systems and natural systems through food, and how climate change is affecting smallholder farmers around the world. So then I went and worked in sustainability consulting in that space, focusing on marginalized super smallholder farmers who were being knocked out by climate change. So that's, and then from that, I went to design for grad school because I felt that there was the gap that I kept finding was on this storytelling, on this visioning piece, and I saw how big organizations, nonprofits, governments, multinational corporations could be pressured to change their behaviors by really large scale changes in expectations and demands from citizenry, consumers, voters. And so I wanted to be part of pushing that definition of sustainability farther forward so that it would produce better outcomes for more people. So that's my education background. I don't know if that answers the question.
Well, but it's fascinating to me that your seeming command of organic chemistry / biochemistry to understand these molecular models, and maybe you've found, often in research we go fill in our gaps, right? And
Yeah.
but it'd be kind of fun to have seen as a college educator, a design student pop up in my OChem or my biochem class because they were highly motivated at understanding fiber structure, versus the normal people that would find their way there. So anyway, they're very, very impressive.
Yeah.
Very
Well,
impressive.
and I think that's one thing that I love as a designer that I think helps me is that I have the title designer. And so then I get to ask questions over and over and over again and advocate for simplification and clarity. So even, I'm not going to try to scroll back to it, but that depressing infographic of where is all the carbon, right? Like that is always presented as logarithmic data because it's insane to present as a count, right? You saw it, like, look, it's so overwhelming, but human beings, and this is connected to like we're very well founded in psychological research, we really ultimately think in count. We barely hold on to fractions and percentages when you like test us with this. So that's part of why like advocating for the human perceiving primate is something that I can do as a designer and be sort of a science translator. And even still, I get, when I collaborated with Philip Lim, he was like, whoa, this is we need to like make this more real. We need to like, you're still too sciencey, I'm sorry. And so I think I probably am.
And too sciencey. What are your thoughts on the non-recycling of currently the non-recycling of textiles? Is there a place or a benefit to take old clothes and do something with them other than put them in landfills?
Yeah, so absolutely not to disparage recycling. It's this is a yes and problem, right? The problem that I see is that we don't have a good record of recycling easy to recycle materials. Like PET plastic water bottles, like they're not the easiest to recycle, but compared to textiles, amazing. Textiles are incredibly complicated for many reasons, one of which is a lot of what we're wearing that has a synthetic petchem origin material is going to be a blend. So like a cotton poly blend, a cotton acrylic blend, and separating those two out to then be able to recycle is incredibly difficult. There's some cool research happening in that space, so it's definitely going to keep evolving. But yes, so we do need to be investing in recycling the textiles we have. We need to consume less in the global north. Like, yes, overconsumption is part of the problem. The business models are part of the problem. The phenomenon of like dead stock, and that fashion brands will burn what they don't sell rather than like discount it deeply. Like there are problems at many, many levels, but what I'm trying to articulate is that we need new non-petchem materials to fill that. Demand is growing by 3 times. We are not going to recycle our way out of that problem, even if we got better at recycling. So that's sort of the premise there. And also back to science, entropy. Entropy is real. Like things fall apart and fray and molecules get disorganized, and it's not going to be this perpetual motion machine of recycling forever.
Well, with your use of the term entropy, let me lead into the next question, is that what's your thoughts about putting plastics in landfill? Would that qualify as sequestering?
That's, I think, a great question, and one of the sort of more provocative outcomes of this line of thinking, right? So in the carbon removal sequestration space, where do we put the carbon that we sequester is a challenge, right? And right now, you've probably encountered this. There's experiments around like injecting it back into old oil drill lines. Like if we can put it deep enough in the ocean, the pressure will be enough and it will turn into crystal. Like where do we put it is a big challenge. And landfills have a really bad rap. A lot of landfills are very bad, but a modern encapsulated landfill that's well managed and maintained, what is the difference between that as a way of sequestering carbon in the form of our materials versus injecting it underground and maybe causing earthquakes? Like back to this like challenge of there's no perfect solution. What's the least bad outcome? And in America, and I've talked to people in the waste hauling space, like we have like 100 years on our landfills in America. It's a luxury of Americans. Obviously, they're not great. But we don't have 100 years on climate change. So maybe they help buy us some time.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so uncomfortable, right? Like,
yeah, interesting. Leslie wants to know, I'm curious, with this algae fashion, what does it feel like? And how does it get cleaned, i.e. hand washing, hang dry, whatever?
Absolutely. Yeah. So my work is sort of a proof of concept pointing in this direction. It's not commercialized. I have not done any of this testing. I've not gotten a rogue dry cleaner to volunteer to see what happens. But there are a lot of other companies in this space who are, again, sort of doing those intermediate steps. So for instance, the dress I did with Philip Lim, the sequins are my marine macroalgae biopolymer. Those are the sequins, the mesh that it's sewn onto, that's a cellulosic that has part of its composition coming from kelp. So I don't want to go back to the slide, but the manufactured cellulosics we can make, we have made for 100 years textiles out of mostly trees. Cellulose is one of the most abundant biopolymers. And so our ability to take cellulose out of things like sugar kelp and plug them into those very well-established systems that's being explored. And there are other companies in this space who are doing like 100% algae in origin. So my particular piece is not to be washer dried, but there are materials that are like on the market that are partially algae, and things coming like really soon that have the hand and feel of like a lyocell or a tencel. They're machine washable. They're like potentially super lovely and indistinguishable, and you get to live your life and not have. And also, like, the more we learn about like microplastics and how our skin is this really open organ, like putting like these black dye is the worst. I'm not perfect here, like directly against your skin. Like, there are people also investigating the health angles of this, but that's sort of to the side. My core interest and advocation is around the climate impact of these things and how do we decarbonize everything.
A couple other comments in the chat are not necessarily questions. I just want to share with you praise. Jane is saying your perspective is very inspirational. It opens the mind to thinking way outside the box. Yeah, I think you're definitely an inspirational faculty leader there. That's phenomenal. George and Marissa are saying 100% agree with how graphical data presentation needs to be more human-centered design. Pam said, I'm so impressed with your presentation, as I would highly recommend this presentation for our whaler group at the San Diego Natural History Museum to hear. Bravo for being innovative and protective of our planet Earth. Back to questions. For algae culture, do you imagine ocean-based farming? Sorry. Ocean-based farming.
Yes, I'll get to that. I actually just want to add one note on the data presentation piece. Another reason why it was important to me to make a garment, to make a thing, and to make something that, and not just a swatch of material either, is that even beyond just graphical data presentation, I'm interested in how so much of the conversation around climate change, biodiversity loss, like sustainability, environmentalism generally. I'm interested in how I can talk to people who don't care about these things like just 20 seconds longer, right? And like there's that moment where it's sort of the eyes glaze over. Everyone has a lot to worry about and they care about and they're stressed out about. And how do you keep people engaged a little bit longer? And there was something about how language, just using words, just using argument, like hits our cognitive prefrontal cortex and gets tied up in all of these politicized in-group, out-group conversations really quickly. And so to make something and not say you should care about climate change, but just to have something that goes straight to the brainstem and is like, it is a thing. I encounter this thing. I'm not being told about it. I can just be drawn to it. So you guys are getting the opposite experience. Most people go to a museum and they see the raincoat and they're like, ooh, and then they start to get into all of the nerdy weeds with me. But that's the invitation. That's the hierarchy. It draws you in. On the ocean-based farming, that's part of why I asked it before we started if you guys had connections to East Coast stuff. So aquaculture and growing algae and seaweed is absolutely a thread I'm interested in, and there's some projects doing that. I'd love if you guys know people on the West Coast who are doing aquaculture like that. It's a thread I want to pull and like exploration, the next sort of phase of research. But there's a lot of reason to believe. I'm thinking of there's an organization on the East Coast that is using aquaculture so integrating seaweed and like bivalve farming to support human communities that have been hit really hard by the decline in the fishing industry there. So how do you create a system that can support humans and their economic activity and create food systems and create environmental benefits, there's something really interesting there. It's worth pausing and saying really clearly that, and I hope this is clear through my elaboration on carbon and where it is in biology and life, but it's not enough for something to be just made of algae, right? It matters the system that is leading you to that point, right? We could make algae materials that were very fossil fuel intensive in other parts of the supply chain, right? It's and this is back to the human cognition thing. It's like it's really easy to be like, this is a thing and it's made like, this is the thing. And everything that precedes it is invisible and everything that follows it is invisible. But how do we hold on to the ecosystems and energies and supply chains that are all part of the impact of the thing? It's not enough just that it's algae. It also, to have it be carbon negative, to have it be ecologically beneficial is much more complex and important to build into however we do this. So ocean-based farming probably is going to be part of that, but how to proceed really carefully into that is a whole set of questions that I'm interested in. It's another reason why macroalgae and not microalgae, right? So in the geoengineering space, there's one of the main proposals that is very feasible is iron seeding. Maybe you guys have encountered this because you're in the space, but one of the limiting factors on marine microalgae on its growth is a lack of iron. So you can sequester a bunch of carbon by modifying a crop duster and flying over the open ocean and dropping iron and causing a bloom. And hopefully some of that will settle to the bottom of the ocean floor and you'll sequester some carbon. And I don't think I need to tell this group what could go wrong by blowing up the base of the food chain in a completely uncontrolled way.
Yeah.
Right? Like, so marine macroalgae is interesting to me because it potentially represents a way to proceed more methodically and be able to pull back if there are unintended consequences that start to emerge. And there already are people doing that crop dusting. Like who gives permission to do that? And they're doing it for fishery reasons, typically not for the climate reasons, but
well, welcome to California. And we do already have that natural process in the terms of what we euphemistically called red tides, which are neither red nor tidal. But those algae blooms and what that does to the ecosystem. So you've got a lot of opportunity. You're not short on opportunity out here in California. Very exciting. We have to make a note to book you in a year or two out and see what you've been up to. Leanne wants to know if feeding seaweed to cows would reduce methane.
There's this is not my area of expertise, but I have a colleague at Stanford who has spun out and is focusing exclusively on a company doing that. So it's definitely a promising area of research.
Our Frank, who's on, said that he thought the presentation was very interesting. He's also happens to be a photographer. So he says, if you ever get to San Diego, I hope to connect and get a portrait or two of you in your designs. So I thought that's kind of cool.
Thanks, Frank. And I know we're at time. I don't want to keep you guys from your busy lives.
Yeah.
Here, I'll stop share.
Yeah.
When you're interesting, we stay on.
Yeah, no, that's fine. We want to be respectful of your time as well.
Yes.
Thank
you very much. This has been fascinating, and I may reach out to your friend with the cows and seaweed.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Best of luck to you.
Yes, best of luck to you, and I'll definitely be reaching out to check on your follow-ups. So thank you. Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you.